Hello, in this video I am going to look a bit more in depth at fiddling with BAT Server and the BAT files and the AVISYNTH files that make up this QTMGC preset. In particular, I'm going to be adding in all these things. The QTMGC preset as a default, it scales stuff by 2 and it deinterlaces it to 50p. I'm going to show you how you can deinterlace it to 25p, and I'm going to show you how you can change the resizing just by changing a few things inside the batch files. If you look at the original, you can see it's got a bunch of different things in here, and I've put in my target path there, but it's got a bunch of other things in here saying more or less what it does. And you might look at that and your eyes might glaze over. Yeah, might be something you don't want to do because you don't want to get this involved. But looking at this, I can see you've got all sorts of different things, but one thing it does say is AVISYNTH templates. And I know a couple of settings in QTGMC, and they're not actually in this file, they're somewhere else. They're in this thing. It's the AVISYNTH template. So AVISYNTH is another free program which basically has a lot of extra effects. It's all free, and QTMGC is part of that. So what this batch file does is it calls in AVISYNTH, loads up a whole bunch of things into AVISYNTH, and then uses that on a clip. Now to do that, it uses an AVISYNTH script. So this is like a batch file, but it's just got .avs at the end as opposed to .bat. This batch file is made up of two things. It's made up of this batch file you can see right here and an AVISYNTH script. Now I can change the batch file just by double clicking on it and adding things in, but I can't change the AVISYNTH script by doing it. So I could come down here and change some of this stuff, and some of this stuff is just like saying what quality of footage it's going into and so on. I can't change the important stuff. So I need to get at that. Now that is on your computer, of course. I'm going to go to the C drive and then program data, look for EDIUS power tools. And by the way, program data might be a folder that you can't see. It's a hidden folder and you can only see it if you say show hidden folders. And of course, hidden folders are hidden for a reason because they do system-y stuff. So you've got to be slightly careful when you're wandering around these things that you don't delete something that's important to your computer. But to see it, and in Windows 11, so I just come up to these dots here, choose Options, go to View and say Show Hidden Files and Folders. If that was not ticked, you wouldn't be able to see it. So you've got to show that, and now it will show you all the hidden files and folders, and you can get to your program data. So I go to Program Data, and then I go to EDIUS Power Tools. And then here you've got lots of stuff to do with the BAT server. So if I come in here, you've got all the BAT files, ones on the timeline, the video files, etc. These are all the things which are in this list. And yeah, I can get to that folder just by right clicking on that and say Open Folder, which obviously would have been quicker than going to the C drive. Takes me straight to that. Then I'd have had to go back to EDIUS Power Tools to be where I need to be to find the synth file. The synth file is under Tools. There you can see a folder that says AVISYNTH, and you notice it says it's under AVISYNTH. And then there it says Templates, and there are my AVISYNTH scripts. So basically I can take these and now change them. And you might notice I've got 6 different variations. One that I've accidentally saved with a .text on it, so that's rubbish. But these lots here are all different script files. They make up my 6 different presets here, because I took the original and I changed it, and then I made up a new batch file, and I said, well, let's go for my second script, QTMGC, tick that one, and so on. So what I did is I went into QTMGC AVS, that's the original, and then you get this huge text file of stuff. Now I just double clicked on that and it went straight into Notepad and opened up the file. Of course, these things don't default to opening with Notepad. I just set it like that. The best thing to do is just to right click on it and say Open With, and then have a look in the list here for Notepad. It should show up in this list, but if not, go look for another app and find Notepad, which happens to be in the Windows folder. There is Notepad. Open, and now it will open with Notepad. Ideally what you do is when you go Open With and you find Notepad, you also tick this thing, Always Use. And that means you don't have to go looking for it in the future. It'll always open with Notepad, which is what I did. It is a text file, but it's got .avs at the end of it. Now, whenever you're looking at this, and the same goes for the batch files, whenever you're looking at this, if you see a hash in front of anything, like so, it means that's not doing anything. When you're doing things like batch files, you stick in a hash and then you can write stuff like just plain notes up the top here, which might be useful to you later on. And most of this stuff is stuff that Mick, who wrote the thing, will actually understand and we probably won't. But for a start, ignore all the stuff with hashes on. So the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to say, I like the deinterlacing, but I don't want to resize it at all. As you might know from other videos, I use Topaz Video, which is an AI upscaler you have to pay for, which I think does a very good job of upscaling, using AI to invent stuff. So I didn't want to do my scaling in EDIUS. In all my testing I've done so far with Topaz, I reckon I get better results if I deinterlace with QTMGC and then I upscale in Topaz. Topaz can deinterlace, but I think QTMGC does a slightly better job. So I like to deinterlace it first and then upscale it, which means I'd like to use this batch file, but I don't want it to scale it at all. And it's set to scale it by 2. So I had to come and look through this and find the thing that controls the upscaling. And they did actually write it on the forums anyway. But coming through all this lot, I know that this thing, spline resize 36, is the thing that's being used to scale. And looking at all these are all things about scaling. The only one without a hash is that one. So that is the thing which lets me decide how much it's being scaled. This thing, the end, which gives you the width and the height, that's got a hash in front of it as well. So that's kind of irrelevant too. Really, you're looking at this here and you want to change that. Now I wanted to change it to be a specific size. So I really wanted to take it so it was 1920 wide, still be 4x3, so I could pan and scan it afterwards. That would be actually 1920 by 1440. That would be a very specific size, which I use a lot for my upscaling. It doesn't do that. This particular type of resizing that's used in here will only do it in multiples of 2. So you can go 2 times, you can go 4 times, 8 times, and so on. So I can't type in the size I want. The most I can do is either turn it off or change it to 4 times or 6 times. Now to do the no resize one, literally I just had to turn it off. And I turned it off simply by putting a hash in the front. That is now not going to be used. I then save that with a new name and I've decided to call it QTMGC no resize. In goes a no resize there. And then I came back to here, double clicked on the batch file, and where it says use that, I instead put in this. So it's exactly the same batch file, but now it's using a different AVISYNTH script. Saved it under a new name. And I'm calling it V2 because I've already got one. Done all this with EDIUS still open. I haven't touched EDIUS at all. That particular batch file is in the bin. So let's go to the bin, my original AVI file, right click and go down to deinterlace. And there is deinterlace V2. So done this whole thing with EDIUS open. So literally just done that, saved it. It's there already. You don't have to keep turning things on and off, which is great. And that created my no resizing one. So in that case, you just set that going. It does the file. Bish bash bosh. I've now got an upscaled version of that, which isn't resized. There you go. This one at the bottom. You can see that one is not resized. It's been square pixeled, which is a very important thing. The original is 720x576, good old fashioned DV, and it's made up of non-square pixels. These things here where you have to get the right aspect ratio or everybody comes out wrong. It's a lot better when you start fiddling around with this stuff to go for square pixels. And a bit of that AVISYNTH file, if I go back to it, is about converting to square pixels, which Mick has all worked out. I don't bother to fiddle with that. It's been square pixeled already. And making it into square pixels will help you a lot later on. But yeah, that's how I did the no resize one. Actually pretty simple where you know where to look. Now to do one where I made it bigger, so one of my complaints here is that this one that was resized by twice still isn't big enough to fit. I can't tell it to be exactly the size I want it to be with this particular type of resizing. So instead, I came into here, went down to the resizing, put that back on, and the only other option is I could go to 4 times. Now 4 times is going to scale it up 4 times, so it's going to be way bigger than high definition. I then saved that with a decent name, came back into the BAT server panel, and again just opened up this thing, changed this to that name. I could put a different description in here if I want to, but can't be bothered. And I'm going to call this 4 times. Now back in EDIUS, I can come back to that, right click, and I can go 4 times resize. You notice I've already got one, but there we are, there's the new one that I've just put in. And that then makes me a file which is 3072 by 2304. So that's 4 times the size of the original. And again, you put it onto the timeline, it makes it fit. But if I go into the layouter and say original size, you'll notice it's now bigger than high def. So to use this, I have to downscale it. Not the perfect way of doing it. I would have liked to scale it to exactly the right size in the first place. But the only option that I have got with this. But I'm thinking that if I make it bigger and then downscale it, it's going to look better than making it smaller and then upscaling it. So that is the 4 times 1 downscaled. Turn that off and you get the 2 times 1 upscaled. Pretty close, pretty close. Or 4 times upscaled versus the original. You can see there, obviously, the upscaled one considerably better. That's DV being upscaled and deinterlaced with EDIUS. That's QTMGC, which has been 4 times scaled and then shrunk down to fit. Not 100% sure that actually upscaling it to 4 times and then downscaling it is better than upscaling it to 2 times and then making it fit. But those are the options you've got with this particular thing. It's basically you can take the files, you can upscale it 2 times, 4 times, 8 times, so on. You can do it in multiples of 2. There are other ways of upscaling using AVISYNTH. Some of them are just things like plain Lanczos, which you can do anyway with EDIUS. If I was to take my non-upscaled version, so let's get rid of that one, and put on the version that I just plain deinterlaced, and I'm going to have to make that flipping thing fit. So here we go. This is just deinterlaced but not upscaled, and then I shoved on the layouter and did the whole thing. This is the version that's been done using the QTMGC upscaling. Honestly, pretty close, but this is only one shot. You'd probably need to examine them using other things as well. Like I said, I think I get better upscaling if I go off and use Topaz to do the upscaling. So I would take my deinterlaced version, find it, pop it into Topaz, add some kind of adjustment to it, and then render it with that. So with this particular shot, I am going to tell it it's progressive, tell it that I want it to be 1920. Well, actually, I know from doing this a lot that actually what I need to do is to tell it to be 1976 across. Because if it's 1976 across, it will get rid of these black bars. And then I'll come down here and I'll use Iris, which is my favorite one for upscaling, and turn on the parameters, go to manual. Generally I click estimate, and then I fiddle with the settings, but I generally end up with about 100% on that and a bit more reducing noise. You have a look at some of my other videos on Topaz for more information on this, but there's a lot of fiddling that goes on in here. I will just make a quick version of that, bring that back into EDIUS. This is the Topaz version, and there you can see you've now got a clip which fits. So if I go into the layouter, check that the scale's 100% and then move that over a bit, it fits. Move it down a bit. I just happen to know with my high 8 camera that setting it to 1976 width gives me enough things just to get rid of those black bars. So now there, you can see the two side by side. So this is the one that's been done with QTMGC. This is the one that's been done with Topaz. Now looking at the Topaz one, obviously it's a lot sharper. It's got finer details that have been put back in the hair. Particularly on a still frame, I think it looks better. It's not perfect, of course. We are working off a NAF High 8 original. Although when you do play it, you might say to yourself, there is something slightly weird about the guy's eyes. And again, this varies depending on the footage. If I put DV into this, I get a better result. But I prefer that. I might have pushed it a little too much, which has ended up with that slightly weird thing around the eyes, but I prefer that to that. And maybe I should go back and not shove the detail slider up to 100, but put it up to about 80, and maybe it'll get a better result. But I am going to be interested in how this develops. When I did my first Topaz video, which was a year or so ago, it wasn't nearly as good as it is now. And if I used the models I was using then, I'd probably get a result that's pretty close to that. But obviously you have to pay for Topaz. All this BAT server stuff is free if you have EDIUS 11. And like I say, there are other free ways of scaling, so it'll be interesting to know what the results for those will be. So if they manage to get included, I'll let you know. Now the other thing that I did, apart from the resizing, was the frame rate. So the way that the QTMGC thing works is it takes an interlaced file and it deinterlaces it and makes it 50 frames per second. As you'll probably be aware, DV files are 25 frames a second, but they're interlaced. So here you can see lower field is 25 frames a second. That means that the whole picture is split up into two halves, and the half of the picture updates every 50th of a second. If you just dump half of it, you end up with basically the result we get in EDIUS, all these jaggies, because it's dumped half of the horizontal. It's dumped one of the fields and it does that. So if you're going to deinterlace it properly, you want to kind of merge the fields together. Now the question is, if you're merging them together, are you going to merge them together so that they're 25 frames a second? Or are you going to merge them together and make 50 frames a second? You've got 50 half pictures, why not make it 50 frames a second? It does depend on what you're going to do with the stuff. You will be aware that interlaced video has a slightly different movement to it to film and 25p video. You'll probably have noticed it more now that we've started using cameras which only do progressive, and you might be looking at stuff and be looking at some kind of pan or something and it looks a bit jerky or the movement's a bit odd because you're filming at 25 frames a second. If you film at 50 frames a second, everything's a bit smoother. So your options here are going to be, do you make it 50 frames a second and nice and smooth, or do you go 25 frames a second, which looks a bit more film-like, but maybe something like a pan might look a bit naff. As a default, it's doing 50. Now, the only thing about it doing 50 is if your project is set to originally 25 frames interlaced. Yeah, so when you make up a new project, obviously you have all these different settings. If you're dealing with interlaced video, you'll probably go for that, or one of the standard def ones, one of these, which are all 50 frames interlaced or 25 frames a second, but interlaced. So if you're in a project like that and then you use QTMGC on a file, it'll make a 50 frames a second file. And if you make a 50 frames a second file, you really want to be in a 50 frames a second project. Well, if you started off with that, or this, or this, or this, you're not in a 50 frames a second project. You're in a 25 frames a second project. And you can't change it to 50. This is something that we've asked for ages. It's not in EDIUS yet. You cannot change the frame rate of your project once it's started. Now, to show all this off, I decided I would start a 50p project. So I came in here and I chose my 50p preset because I knew I was going to deinterlace it to 50p and I wanted to make 50p stuff. So I started a 50p project. So a very, very important thing to do at the start of the project, decide what you're going to do with it. If you're going to want to deinterlace it and you're going to try and get the best out of it and make it 50p, then start a 50p project. I've been doing all my deinterlacing by putting DV footage on a timeline, which is actually 50p. And then I've deinterlaced it, which has made my 50p QTMGCs. But I'm only seeing that because I'm in a 50p project. If I did this in a 25p project, then EDIUS would automatically take my 50p thing, shove it onto the timeline, and get rid of one of the fields. It would still look better than the way that EDIUS does it, but it would end up with the 25p movement. And the only way you'd get the 50p movement would be to start a new project and then put all the clips on the timeline again and effectively remake the edit. I have got some kind of workarounds, not using EDIUS, but just taking it off to different programs. I might do a different video about that, but right now there is literally no way of coming up to EDIUS and then just going project settings and changing 25 to 50p. So for a start, if you're doing this, decide, are you going to go to 25p or are you going to go to 50p? If you're going to go to 50p, you must start in a 50p project because it will save you time later on. Having said that, suppose you are in a 25p project and you want to keep it 25p. Maybe you actually like the 25p look. Some people do like the look of 25p. Now, if you want to be 25p, what do you do about it? Because if you use this QTMGC, it will basically do it at 50p. So let me just start up a new 25p project. So there I've now got the 50p BAT server over the AVI file. And now you can see the DV file on the 25p timeline and the 50p one on top of it. So original, deinterlaced. This is not using Topaz. This is just using QTMGC right inside of EDIUS. But it's made a 50p file. Now, if you put a 50p file on a 25p timeline, EDIUS will lose half of it. It will try and interpolate between the two. And of course, you've got three types of interpolation in EDIUS. So if I go to right-click time effect field option, this is where your interpolation comes in. It generally defaults to frame blending. And you might find if you do frame blending, depending on the different frame rates, that you actually end up with a bit of ghosting in various areas. So when I'm doing this, I like to turn off everything. I like to go to nearest neighbor. Nearest neighbor is 50p, it'll just dump one of them. That could just take your 50p thing and now it becomes 25p. And you could just do that. You don't have to make a 25p original. If I'm doing a lot of this, I'll come into the field option and before I start adding things onto the timeline, I will make sure it's on nearest neighbor and save that as the default. So that's the thing that's used on every clip from now on. Does mean it's used on slow motion clips. Suppose I wanted to slow this down now that I've set that. So let's go to speed and set this to 20%. This is where you end up with jaggy looking naff slow motion. So with the clips with slow motion, I'd have to go back into the time effect field option and choose something, probably optical flow, to get a smoother look on it. But because I'm mixing frame rates, I like the default to be nothing. Just drop stuff. And then I can add on the other effects afterwards. And of course, you know, with this finer field option, you can select lots of clips and apply all to them at once. You can just leave it like that. So I could be in a 25p project, just deinterlace it, then bung it on there and let EDIUS just chop something out of it. But if I wanted to, I could make up a 25p deinterlacing thingamy-bob, which is what I was really going to talk about. Let me just undo that so it's back to normal. And I would do that by, again, fiddling with this. I happen to know from my fiddling with another program how to get it to do it at half the frame rates. What I do is I would come into this thing here. So looking at all these QTMGC presets, right? I've come to that one, which is the one without the hashtag, and I add onto it, comma, FPS div ISOR equals 2. Then I save that with a new name. I started off with using one that's already set to 4 times. Let's put that back to 2. And then I'll make up a BAT file which uses that AVS file. Mine happened to be in the bin, so I'd go back to the original file here, right click and deinterlace 25p. You notice I have actually made myself a no resize one, a 2 times resize one, and a 4 times resize one. But if I do this, it'll then make a 25p clip. So that matches my timeline. Down at the bottom here, bung it on top. Can use the same layout from the other one. That is now a proper 25p clip, as opposed to the one underneath it, which is a 50p clip and has been chomped. You possibly won't notice any difference between the two. So this one here is the one that's been deinterlaced to 50p. This one that's been deinterlaced to 25p. It's entirely possible you won't be seeing any difference at all on YouTube, because of course YouTube will take this stuff and it will 30p it and then it will recompress it and all sorts of stuff. And I'm not sure what I will do in the future. I think probably I will actually make all my clips 50p. That means if I do want to slow any of them down, because it's a 50p clip and it's got more information, it might slow it down better in EDIUS than a 25p one, because 25p is well known for not being very good at being slowed down. So you can see that's my 25p clip slowed down. Let's even put the optical flow on. Good old optical flow. Optical flow not doing a bad job of adding that. Oh, I know there's a bit of nonsense going on around here. There was a bit of nonsense going on around there, because there's less stuff to start with than there was in the 50p one. So here we have 50p slow mode, 25p slow mode. You're getting more cobblers happening around here than, the 50p one is slow motioning better. So possibly it is better to just let it do 50p even if you are working on a 25p project. Ideally, like I said, if I was going to do this and my plan was to deinterlace this all at some point, I'd work in a 50p project to start off with. But if you did want to make a 25p original, that's how to do it. Yeah, and I might make a 25p original because maybe I'm not carrying on and doing this inside of EDIUS. Maybe I'm going somewhere else. I did have hassles trying to do effects. So I was actually mixing some CGI, which we'd rendered at 25 frames a second, because rendering CGI takes flipping forever. So you render it twice as much of it, it takes twice as long as flipping forever. So we rendered the effects at 25, but then I started to try and mix it with video, which was at 50, which I was doing in Fusion, and it got me into a bit of a mess. So maybe you want to do it at 25. If you want to do it at 25, that's the way to do it. You could just make up one of these things with this FPS divisor in there, and it'll make up 25p for you. That's just an introduction to this new thing that's been put into the BAT server. Great to be able to do that off the timeline in EDIUS. If you want to see what I was doing before, well, it was taking the timeline. It was then exporting all the files trimmed down with handles to be 25 to AVI files. It was again going into a thing called stacksrep to deinterlace them all. So make it out of here, make some more stuff, stacksrip it, then take it from stacksrip into Topaz. This will make my life a bit easier. Better deinterlacing than I can get in any other program. The best deinterlacing built into a program is in Resolve, in my opinion. If you get the studio version, that's got good deinterlacing which you can use on the timeline, but this is better. I had studio version of Resolve. I stopped using that. I started using QTGMC. Be interesting what you think. When I did a video on it, a couple of people said they actually preferred YADIF, which of course you've still got YADIF. You've got all the other things that I mentioned in my very first version. So anyway, I hope you found that useful. Obviously, I'll do more stuff about the BAT server as it goes by, and maybe I'll do that video I was talking about where I try and get an EDIUS 25p project changed to a 50p one, which, to be perfectly honest, I do using other programs like Resolve. But maybe I'll get onto that one later on. Anyway, if you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, all the usual kind of stuff. If you want to know more about EDIUS and me and my training and so on, then visit www.dvctraining.co.uk. And apart from that, I'll see you next time.